Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. It is a nice sunny afternoon here in Houston with kind of the first wisps of fall starting to show up for us. And so we're so excited today to have CJ Cooke with us to talk about her newest book, The Nesting. If you guys are unfamiliar with her, she is an award-winning poet and novelist published in 23 languages. She teaches creative writing at the University of Glasgow, where she also researches the impact of motherhood on women's writing and creative writing interventions for mental health. How are you doing today?
I am doing really well. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. So it's what, like 8 in the evening for you now?
Yes, it's very dark outside. So I guess I just saw that it's 32 degrees in Texas. Is that right?
So what is that for us? That is, let's
It's
see.
like 90.
Yeah, that seems about right. So it's like 90-ish, which is kind of cool for us this time of year. We always joke, you know, we'll get one day where the weather is kind of nice and cool, and then we think fall's coming, and then it'll be like 100 degrees for Halloween. You just really never know.
Okay. Yeah, it's a little bit colder than that here. I'm in Scotland.
Well, thank you for joining us this afternoon. So you guys, we are talking about her new novel, The Nesting, which is actually coming out this coming Tuesday. So you can get your pre-orders in for it now. So Caroline, to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about the new book?
Yeah, certainly. So it's a Gothic thriller. The Nesting is, I always knew it was going to be a Gothic book. I've become really interested in this idea of the Gothic as being the genre for the moment. I think it deals with despair quite a bit and loss and those sort of really extreme experiences and human emotions. And so anyway, this book is a Gothic suspense, Gothic thriller set in Norway and in a very sort of remote part of Norway where an architect and his family, he's from London. He's trying to build a super high concept, eco-friendly summer home in this region of Norway because his wife was from Norway. She was born there. And he has hired a girl, she's 28, called Lexi, to be the nanny for his children. And Lexi she isn't a qualified nanny. And in fact, when we begin the book, she has she's at a really tough time in her own life, and she's had a really tough life and this is sort of the pivot of her life, and she has happened upon this opportunity, so she's going to be a nanny for these girls, but as the story unfolds, she begins to feel very unnerved by the place that she's in Norway, and the wife who died by suicide. Lexi starts to feel that perhaps that wasn't suicide, there was murder, and there's other kind of ghostly goings on, and lots of creepy atmosphere.
So if you guys are watching on Facebook Live, if you have questions, you can leave those in the comments, and I will make sure that we get to those before we end the chat today. Yeah, one of the things that I love about this novel is you take kind of all of those great Gothic tropes of like this house that almost has a personality of its own, kind of the distant father husband figure, the housekeeper who's kind of, aloof, you don't know what's going on with her. You just kind of take all of these things and you kind of throw them at it, and it's like one of those things, like if you love all of those Gothic tropes, like this book has all of them in a really interesting way for you to just dive in. So one of the things that I was curious about, you said Lexi kind of sees this opportunity that she grasps, so which she comes through by kind of dishonest means. How do you take a character who kind of one of the earliest things we know about her is sort of her, I guess, a dishonest way of getting this job? How do you make that character kind of reliable or credible, kind of knowing that that's how they got this job?
Yeah, well, I think that I didn't, when I started writing the story, I didn't begin to sort of fully plot the whole story until I'd written about the first 3 or 4 chapters. So I had to kind of get to know Lexi myself before it all happened. And because I was so sold on her and her voice was so strong, she kind of was one of those rare characters that just was there from the get-go. From the minute I started writing this book, her voice was on the page, and I was so curious about what was kind of unfolding as I wrote that I just went with it. And I was so moved by her, and I spend quite a bit of time, I think, at the beginning of the novel setting up her story, because it very much is her story. I hope that the reader sees how I think that Lexi's story really comes together through the experiences she has in Norway and with the girls and so on. But you're right. I think the reader has to be on board with Lexi to see how she gets this job and where she's at when she gets this job. And because she's so desperate and in such a terrible position that hopefully, that was a risk I took, but I was rooting for her. So I thought hopefully the reader will too.
Yeah, I think it definitely pays off, because you see her at this very low point, and you see that this is an opportunity for her. And, so early on, she's trying to kind of better herself or pull herself out of the situation that she's in. And I think you definitely succeeded in making the reader kind of invested in rooting for her as she's going through this. You also mentioned, that kind of Gothic fiction is sort of this kind of the genre of the moment. We're seeing such a resurgence in it recently. Yeah. Why do you think that kind of authors and us as readers are kind of drawn to this genre again all of a sudden?
Yeah, well, I do think it has a lot to do with what's going on in the world. It's so inexplicable and so surreal. And I think that the Gothic deals with the surreality that can occur. I think that time collapses when you're in these extreme kind of moments, and Gothic deals a lot in death, and really I think mines those experiences and human emotions in particular, and to try and capture something, and all the different events that are happening in the world right now. And I was thinking of Australia and the loss of 1 billion animals. I don't even know how you begin that event alone. How do you begin to process that, never mind try and portray it or capture it? And I think the Gothic is absolutely, far from horror even, although there's similarities between the two genres, and psychological suspense and so on. The Gothic really deals with that, the surreal element, as well as the quality of despair. I think there's a relationship for me between the Gothic and despair that is really interesting. There's no other genre for me that deals with despair quite the way the Gothic does. And I think that, I'm very nerdy when it comes to thinking through about form and genre. And so I thought deeply about it, and that was the conscious choice that I made with this book. I wanted to look at the impact of, of what's happening on the environment, and that very much underpins the novel, but I couldn't go too deep. I hope that I've managed a kind of light touch, that it's strong enough but not overbearing in the book. But my thinking through about the climate crisis was massive, and so far from just depicting glaciers calving and so on, I think the use of genre here was key for me to try and to capture that sense of despair and loss that we're all feeling right now.
Yeah, we've seen, I think that there's something, Gothic novels, I think for a lot of us, are kind of some of the early things that kind of we read and really kind of fell in love with when we're starting to fall in love with fiction. And we've seen kind of with everything going on in the world, people are kind of really going back to like classic mysteries we've talked about on several of these live events, that like we just can't keep like Agatha Christie books in stock because people just kind of want that stuff that's like familiar to them. And I think that's definitely been a comforting thing for people to be able to do that. So what do you think are some of the differences between kind of the classic Gothic fiction that we're used to and kind of the new modern takes on it that we're starting to see?
I guess it's to do with the use of tropes. I think we're so familiar with those tropes, and it's the the differences now. It's thinking through those old big Victorian mansions that can purvey or are prevalent in the classic Gothic. Now it's we don't have so many of those around, and I suppose with this book, the house that I've depicted here, there's two. There's Granhus, which is the old Norwegian kind of lodge that they stay in, but also Tom's building a very high concept, super modern, eco-friendly, I guess it's a pod on the side of the cliff. And that for me, that grew out of watching a lot of architecture programs. So we have this resurgent, this interest in homes and home building and so on. So that for me was quite an important tweak on the Gothic. But it is exciting, and it's interesting, isn't it, to engage with these familiar tropes, but to see them being done in a way that speaks to our current moment and to, you know, to how we experience the world right now.
Yeah, Ruth Ware in her Turn of the Key kind of sort of did something similar where like her house, instead of being environmental, it was like super high tech where like, you know, the refrigerator talked to you and stuff like that. And I thought that was also an interesting way to kind of give the house a personality. I also, like you mentioned this, you know, in Gothics, you're so used to kind of having that sense of foreboding and kind of otherworldly stuff kind of just lurking there. And I thought that the way that you use kind of the environment, like the blurb on the front of it says, Mother Nature always protects herself by whatever means necessary. And just kind of using that, whether it's kind of the folklore and the folk tales about kind of Mother Nature and like rivers being angry, I thought the way that you pulled that in to kind of give that sense of foreboding was really interesting too.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah. Well, yeah, as I said, the environment for me was one of the key things that I wanted to write about in this book. I think with this story, I kind of had these bunch of topics that I was really passionate about, and then I sort of found a way to write about them. I didn't want to sort of shoehorn them in, but I wanted to make sure that they were part of the story, and certainly Mother Nature and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, was key. I did visit the Arctic for this book, and I wanted to do that. But you know, one of the reasons was to see the impact of climate crisis on the Arctic as well. So yeah, and folklore obviously is I'm not giving too much away when I say that folklore is key here as well. It was important, I suppose, to try and embody the environment. What do we mean when we talk about the environment? So I had to sort of try and give it a bit of a face or a human shape.
What kind of research did you do into the environmental things that they were using for the house, like that kind of technology?
Well, so I got an Arts Council grant from the Arts Council of England. I used to live in England, and so they were really great. They gave me a grant to go over. I went 4 times to Norway. I wanted to kind of go at different times a year, and also I couldn't go for like long periods each time. But I went to different parts of Norway, and one time I met with the co-director of the Nordic Office of Architecture, John Arne Bjørknes, and he was very generous and was able to kind of give me guidance on the sort of logistics of building in a remote part of Norway, because I didn't want to fudge those at all. I wanted, and you can only glean so much off the internet, so, and things change quite a bit. So I did want to get that kind of insight. But I think being in Norway for me was absolutely crucial to be able to capture a lot of the scenery and the people and the food. And although the folk tales are they're fictional, I do use an element of Scandinavian folklore, but I make up the stories. I suppose I was interested in the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that make up our cultures. So yeah, so that all came from that research.
And so you said the folk tales, like you said, you made those up. So
Yeah.
did you do that as you were writing the book, or was it something that like you wrote the story, then you were able to go back and then tailor those to the story that you had written already?
Well, it's funny because I can do weird really well. So at one point in the first draft that I submitted to my publisher, I saw your cat just go past. Standard Zoom me. Um, so at one point I had my publisher read this part. I won't give it away, but she'd read this part where there was like animal prints in the room, and she loved that. And I was like, oh, good. So I can get more weird then. So I was sort of given a bit more. Sometimes I feel I have to rein in the weird, but I was given free rein. And so for me, in the next sort of edits, I added those stories in or amplified them and the sort of ideas that I had. And for me, they were a way of kind of symbolizing the emotional core of the story. And yeah, like I said, letting my weird go full on.
So when you're doing something like that, how do you know? Obviously, you have an editor that you work with who can kind of give you some guidance on stuff like that, but how do you know how far you can push the weird and how much you need to kind of dial the weird back?
Well, like I said, I was a bit scared because I I can really, it's just a sort of natural inclination of my writing. I could just go there. But I was tentative. So I wanted to see what kind of reaction I got. And she loved it so much, actually. She was just like, oh my gosh, you know, that's really great. And we could have more of that. And I thought, really? It's music to my ears. I'll go a bit further with that. So that was lovely, actually, to kind of, to get that feedback and to see that someone else was into what I was doing, you know. So I just, yeah, it is, sometimes you don't know how people are going to take it, and if it's just me. But I guess it was similar when I was writing Lexi. I had a sort of idea for this book that was going to be a lot more serious and very serious Gothic, but Lexi's voice she's very funny, and very, very witty and kind of quirky. So that was a joy to write, actually. That was a lot of fun, which was an odd experience, maybe, to write a Gothic novel. It was fun, but yeah, it was. So.
And where did the idea of having her be kind of a budding author come from?
Maybe it was, I think it was probably when I was writing the book, you know, that kind of, I don't know, to be honest, I don't know. It just appeared on the page and I went with it. I guess it's part of the creative process. You kind of experiment with things like I did with the folk tales. And then you think that works. Like there's a character, as you know, in the book, Dora. That was not planned. Dora just became this character and I thought she was great, and I thought I have to keep Dora in. So Dora was a character and had her own little kind of dealio in the book. So that you just experiment, and the stuff that maybe doesn't work so much you take out. But a lot of it was just that experimentation, and you think, yeah, I like that, I'll keep it.
And one of the things I think that's kind of a fun twist on it as well is, like we've said, you know, you said it in Norway, you know, usually we're used to these like kind of big Gothic houses kind of on the cliffs of Cornwall. So it was really nice to see you kind of pick the location up and move it somewhere where people wouldn't, I guess maybe not necessarily expect a Gothic novel to be set, but at the same time makes perfect sense for a Gothic novel to be set kind of in the middle of a fjord in Norway.
That was my thinking. That just made sense. I think I put a Facebook call out for people to suggest where I should set the next novel, because setting is really important. And someone had mentioned like the Faroe Islands, and my mind has kind of drifted towards Scandinavia, but I hadn't actually been to that region at all. I hadn't been to Norway ever, or I've been to Iceland since as well, but I hadn't been anywhere like that previously. But the more I kind of thought of the tone of the story, and I'm very visually minded. I used to be a filmmaker, and so I kind of think of it like a film. And I guess what I saw, when I researched Norway, I thought, you know, this is really the kind of setting. And it was, when I visited it, it was just perfect. It felt like everything that had been in my head was suddenly just there. So yeah, I also admire Norway, I think, in terms of reinventing those tropes. Norway is such a kind of progressive country that in terms of that political strand that runs through the book, that was important for me as well.
And it also works because, you know, so much of a Gothic, I think, kind of depends on the character being kind of isolated somewhere in the middle of nowhere where they can't just like run down the street and say, hey, there are creepy things happening in this house. So I think that you know, the isolation of the fjord kind of really lends itself well to the genre too.
Yeah. And the weather, like the sort of prevalent dark.
Yeah. So Lindsay asks in the comments, what is your favorite Gothic novel?
Oh gosh. I have many favorite Gothic novels. I guess I think The Haunting of Hill House, probably, although people would call that a horror, but for me it's very Gothic. So I think The Haunting of Hill House. I mean, Shirley is the queen. So yeah.
It's one of my favorites too. It's always fun to sell people, but I always have to tell them, like, look, if you're expecting it to be like super ghosty like the movie is, it's not. It's all about like the atmosphere and that creepy sense of dread. That's a really good choice.
Yeah. That the sense of dread, what goes on in your head, is so important, isn't it? So yeah. I think that's what makes it Gothic for me.
Yeah. It's really fun to see kind of the rise in kind of the domestic thriller that we've seen just kind of in the last couple of years. And I guess it kind of makes perfect sense that because it's so much of those are kind of unreliable narrators and kind of what's going on in your head and is it actually going on around you, it kind of seems actually, now that we're talking about, it's kind of a natural progression that like the next thing that would be kind of start to bubble up would be kind of some of the Gothic stuff, because they share so many of the same elements and kind of blend together so well.
Yeah, they do. I completely agree. So although this is sort of, everyone's like, oh, this is a very different novel and it's a shift, and I'm like, well, I don't know. It's kind of, I can see there's a relationship between the two. So
yeah. So what do you think, since you've written several books and they're all kind of standalones, what do you think is the one thing that all of your books kind of have in common, or that kind of links them and brands them as kind of one of your novels?
Yeah, so I think I'm always interested in the unseen, and that maybe that sounds terribly vague, but to me, I'm interested in the things that we can't see that are very, very real, whether it's mental illness or it's the supernatural. It's just those kind of untangible or intangible kind of, but very palpable or sensory kind of experiences that almost lack definition. So that that liminal space between fact and fiction, or reality and fantasy, just that in between world. I don't know that I'm comfortable with it being fantasy as such, but yeah, the kind of space between.
One of the things I also enjoyed is that you kind of come at the story from several different mediums, whether it's, Lexi is an author or the previous wife is a photographer, and then almost kind of like the science aspect from the environmental issues surrounding building the house. So it's really cool to see you kind of take all of these other different mediums and kind of use those as a way to tell the story.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. Yes. And sometimes it's just good to, there's so much research that goes into a book that when you kind of remember something that you like, because I remembered, I used to be a photographer at one point, and I worked with the traditional 35mm film. I worked in a darkroom, and I try to explain what a darkroom is to my kids, and it's like trying to talk to them about cassette tapes, like what, the concept of no Netflix, but I just, it was a joy to kind of bring that experience and that memory back in a kind of useful way, because I think there's something very beautiful and almost emotional about how film used to be processed and how you used to, take pictures and you'd have to wait for them to be developed. So it's a whole different way of processing an image. So those different, thinking about architecture and photography and those different mediums. And also I think, I was thinking very deeply about the relationship between Tom and Aurelia, and I just thought they need to be two kind of artistic but practical people. If she works in finance, I just don't know that they're gonna gel. So
you also get, the bonus with her being a photographer, like the added creepiness of the basement dark room kind of added in there. So we had another question from the crowd. Wilkie wanted to know, was it difficult writing your first Gothic novel?
No, far from it. This one was a pleasure to write. You never know what you're going to get with I know I sound like Forrest Gump, but you never know what you're going to get with each novel. You have an idea in your head, and it's the best idea you've ever had. But then when you begin to put it down, it can go its own way. And in a way, this book did go its own way, but it went in a much better way, I think, because the voice was so strong. I had very little that I cut from the book, which was great, but I just felt like she really guided the story. I did plot it once I had those 3-4 chapters done. Like I said, I did plot it then, but and that was mostly to remind myself of what was sort of going to happen in the shape of the story. But actually, no, I loved it. I feel I've found my calling with the Gothic. I feel like the book I've just finished for next year, it's Gothic. It's a bit more folk horror, but I definitely see that it's Gothic. But yeah, I loved going to the weird places that I had not gone before. So,
And it's great too that you have like you woven such a good solid mystery in it too. So that way, you know, people who don't maybe necessarily read Gothics but just want kind of a really good mystery will also be able to pick it up and kind of maybe then fall in love with some of those Gothic elements and kind of expand their reading horizons a little bit too.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
hopefully.
So we mentioned Lexi being an author. So the thing that she's working on is she's trying to write her own Scandinavian crime novel. Are you a fan? Do you read Scandinavian crime novels yourself?
Um, I kind of do. Like, I can't say that I have bookshelves full of them, but yeah, I dabble in Scandinavian and kind of Nordic noir, and it's certainly becoming. I think it's becoming more, you know, more popular these days. But yeah, um, I I don't know where the idea for her coming up with this sort of novel came from. It just something that showed up on the page, but I didn't have any kind of reference points that I wanted to be sort of intertextual or anything like that. But yeah, I also was kind of scared of reading too much around it because I didn't want to be too samey as anything. A lot of people have compared this book to Ruth Ware's Turn of the Key, and I was kind of horrified when I found out there was a similarity between the opening of my story and hers, because you don't, you know, it's like I didn't plan that. I guess we're in all in sync.
Right. Well, and I think what's so interesting about stuff like that is, yeah, there are definitely some similarities because if you're looking at kind of the source material that you guys are using, like we've talked about, you know, those Gothic tropes are tropes for a reason. So it's always interesting to see how people are going to take kind of those same elements and then come up with something that's kind of still uniquely your own as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think even like the nanny trope is becoming more popular because it's a great way to kind of introduce a character to a family, and they have to become so involved in a family's life. And I think for, you know, for me, you know, making her a nanny was a conscious decision, because with my own children, I know that the relationships I have with their other caregivers, you know, are so important. You know, they become essential parts of your lives. And this story, Tom, he would never otherwise have a connection with someone like Lexi. She's of a completely different class, and that class dynamic was interesting to me, because he's so, you know, he's upper, well, he's not middle class, he's rich, whereas she is, you know, fully poor, she's homeless and so on. But yet she becomes essential to his life. So I think there's something in that trope as well that has definitely got a modern take on it. And you know, we're all thinking about childcare a lot more these days, much more than the housekeepers, I suppose.
It's also a great way, the nanny trope. It's also a great way to kind of introduce a character into kind of this world that's already kind of built and formed, and for
Yeah,
that character to come in and not necessarily have kind of any allegiances with
yeah,
either side, and kind of then be able to, in some cases, kind of be so easily swayed by stuff that you're not ever sure whether or not like the information that they're receiving is correct or not.
yeah. And also, I think in this story, for me, it was a good way of I love exploring the relationships between the characters, and with Lexi and Gaia in particular, they form this lovely bond. That I just, you know, I could have written about that for 5 books in itself, but I was really interested in exploring that kind of relationship, and how it actually then has this impact on Lexi in terms of helping her heal and confront her past in a healthy, really, you know, dynamic way. So yeah, there was a lot to it that I wanted to explore in that way.
But it was so nice to see kind of that almost instant connection that the two of them have. It's kind of one of those early things that just kind of makes you really want to root for Lexi and hope that kind of even as things are unfolding, that things are going to turn out for her, because she just, like I said, she just meets this child and is just like immediately in love with her.
Yeah, no, that's good to hear. I have to say, when I wrote that scene, because it hasn't changed when she kind of meets little Gaia, and I just think they have this instant connection because they've experienced such loss. Although Lexi hasn't lost her mother, she has in a way, just in a different way.
Yeah. One of the things that I was reading about was that you actually helped create kind of when the pandemic started happening, you actually helped put together a virtual book festival. Can you tell us a
That's
little bit about that?
Oh yes, I'd love to. So yeah, it is called the Stay at Home Literary Festival, and it's got a website, stayathomelitfest.co.uk. And so yeah, I was due to promote my book from last year. It was published in the UK, but it was called The Blame Game, and I had some author events booked down in England. So I was meant to get trains, and it had been set up for months, and then it obviously got cancelled. And I thought, oh, what a shame! I can't just kind of set up a Zoom call, because I've been teaching the distant learning program in creative writing at Glasgow for the last 6 years. So we use Zoom, or we had been using Zoom prior all the time. And then I kind of put a tweet out saying, hey, just with everything that's happening, we're in this awful, awful global surreal event, this moment. Wouldn't it be great if we had like a literary festival? Who would be interested? And actually, the tweet got such a huge response that I thought, right, well, I better sort of do something here. And I put together a Google Doc and kind of cascaded it to people. And yeah, so within like 11 days, I had hundreds of authors signed up to do all these events, and I just used Zoom. And it was all, I think what was good is, I felt like I could take risks, that it didn't have to be perfect and polished, because we were all at home. So no one could physically go anywhere anyway. But it also meant, what I thought was a real boost was you had authors chatting from their kitchen table or their spare room. And it was so new. Like, I think now we're all so used to doing things in Zoom. But back then, like back in the distant days of March, some people had never even heard of Zoom. And now, obviously, I think we're using Zoom just for everything. Like my daughter's birthday is next week, and she's going to have a Zoom party, I think. So, although we're slowly kind of coming out of it, at the same time, we're not in Scotland. We're not allowed to have like groups of people over. So her birthday parties had to be cancelled. Anyway, the festival was just a wonderful, wonderful event. And I really think that the landscape of live literature has changed, that we will be doing these because how great is it that right now you're in Texas and I'm in Scotland, and we can just do this, and the picture quality is great, and it's ideal. And I think that there's so many people that, regardless of lockdown or not, that they can't access these live literature events. They can't necessarily just get childcare or leave their home. There's a lot of accessibility reasons why people can't get out physically to go to physical events. So having it online is ideal.
Yeah, it's been nice on our end. We've had customers for years say like, hey, can you figure out a way to show your in-store events online? And we just had kind of never figured it out.
Yeah.
So early days, we were luckily, thanks to some really helpful book publicists, we were able to kind of get up and running and be able to do stuff like this. And we're really excited to see like what it'll look like later. About a third of what we did before the pandemic was all mail order for customers. And it's been really nice to actually see like the names of our mail order customers pop up in these chats, who have never been able to see any of our events and kind of get to see what we actually do in the store.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Or even just in April, we did one with Alexander McCall Smith, and he's sitting in his beautiful, gorgeous writing room, his library, and he's like, oh, he turns the camera and we get to see like where he gets to sit and write all of his stuff. So it's been really amazing to see the stuff that we wouldn't have gotten to.
Oh my God. Yeah. I just think it's more intimate. I do. I think that it's more intimate. There's a community aspect of it. The people for the festival, that's all people kept saying, was the community aspect was enormous. And to have that intimacy with an author who, like I said, you see them as human beings in their own home. I mean, yes, some people had beautiful settings, and I've obviously tried to curate my setting with some bookshelves here. But it was actually nice just to have people be normal human beings, and and it didn't matter so much if we had like sound problems or technical problems, because it was just the rawness of it made it more informal and friendly. And I just think that's tremendous. That's what literature is. It's not meant to be a big formal affair. But yes, I wouldn't say no to a nice writing room like Alexander McCall Smith.
It's been one of the things that's been hard. Like the bookstore actually just started opening for appointments about a month ago. So during the week, Monday through Thursday, we're there to kind of just do curbside pickup, and then Fridays and Saturdays we're open for customers to have appointments. But just that sense of community and being able to have people in the store and get to interact with customers and readers and chat books with people is one of the things that we've missed. And also, you know, we just celebrated the store's 40th anniversary. And there are so many authors that we would get to see every year. And like, you look forward to getting to see your friends and your family as they come through, and not being able to do that's been tough. So it's been nice to be able to do this. Or in your case, you know, get to meet new people who knows if we would have actually gotten, you know, if you would have been able to come to the US for a tour and still be able to kind of bring you to readers without either one of us having to go anywhere.
Yeah, you can just sit on the sofa and watch on your phone. It's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love it.
So one of the things I thought was interesting was that your book, The Nesting, comes out here on Tuesday, but it's not out in the UK for another couple of weeks. Usually we see that kind of flopped. So
I know. Yeah. I thought it was interesting that's the way around. It's just they're two different publishers, and I guess they have a different schedule. So yeah, it comes out on Tuesday. So I'll be celebrating on Tuesday, and then I'll be celebrating again. The 15th of October is the UK date. So that's fabulous.
So publishing kind of with two different publishing houses and kind of two different countries like that, what is the editing process like? Are there like copy edits where like maybe the US publisher thinks like maybe this phrase is too British or too UK that you have to tweak things?
Yeah, it differs. So I've been published by a number of different publishers now. I've been with HarperCollins in the UK now for the past 4 books. But yeah, so in this case, my publishers in the UK and the US work together. My editors work together, and yeah, sometimes there were phrases like, for instance, I have Lexi at the beginning of the book. Her friend Meg makes her dinner. She makes her a chip buddy. I can't remember if that's kept in the book or not, but I was quite adamant, I think, at one point that it was kept in the book. But everyone on like my Facebook page, I said, you know, if you're in the States, do you know what a chip buddy is? And everyone's like, a what? What is a chip buddy? And I said, it's a French fry sandwich. And it's like, why would you eat that? And I'm like, I don't know. It's just a thing in the UK that, you know, it sounds really gross, but as a kid, I would frequently have a chip buddy. In fact, I think they were sold in the shops. So yeah, just they did question, I think, certain things like that, but nothing too different. I think they are both basically the same. So, but I have had instances where they've sort of asked for more substantial changes.
I have the palate of an 8-year-old, so a French fry sandwich sounds amazing to me. I also thought it was interesting how different the covers for the US and the UK are. The UK one has this kind of the beautiful stag and kind of all of the illustration on it. Oh,
I've got it here. Yeah. Look at that. It's so different, eh?
Yeah. So were you involved in the process of choosing covers or with the differences between them at all?
Well, with the UK, they kind of, I remember about a year ago, we went out to dinner and they showed me like a kind of range of about 8 or 9 different covers. And they were all quite similar. Well, pretty similar. There was like a theme, but this one, I was like, oh my goodness, that is amazing. So we went with that one, and it really is beautiful. And with the US cover, yeah, they showed me 2 different variations. The first one was quite, it was really haunting and abstract, and I did love it. But I think this one has more story. So I love both of them, to be honest. They are very different. But yeah, I think I do love that the US cover has the scene that I had in my head for the fjord. Like that to me is just brilliant. So
yeah, it's interesting how like they're so vastly different, but they both capture the book so well.
I know, right? Yeah, but I think also the colors that are used, the vivid red and blue on the US cover is just phenomenal. So yeah,
it's also interesting how they kind of, the US one almost, like if you didn't know how different the UK one was, it actually almost kind of looks like a UK cover too. Just kind of the text and the blocking, like they have a very specific look. So it's kind of cool that they kind of kept some of that influence in there too.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, there's always a kind of dialogue between covers. So it depends on what kind of, you know, trend is going on pictorially in each country. So maybe that's it as well. I don't know, but I love both of them. So I'm lucky that way. Sometimes I really don't like my covers, but in this case I did.
Good. So in cases where you don't, is it one of those things where you just kind of choose to pick your battles and kind of just grit your teeth and kind of do it, and maybe because you know that you might potentially want to like pick a battle over something else later?
Yeah, well, and you know what, sometimes like with foreign publishers as well, like you know, because my books get published in different languages, and sometimes you literally have no idea at all until you get sent a copy of the book, and then you see the cover. It's like, oh, okay, all right. And that I think you just have to go off the judgment of the publisher, because again, it's different markets, but it is exciting to see the different faces that your book can get, and sometimes different titles as well. But in this case, yeah, my title got used, so they didn't change the title, which is good.
That's interesting too, because you don't hear that often, that kind of the title that the author has and that they're working with actually ends up being kind of the title that ends up.
Yeah, it's something I try to get my students to think about as well, because the title is the name of your book, and to have that changed can be difficult, but it's it's so important that the publisher thinks about the market and about the sort of what people are reading and the trends and so on. So I do understand why they would want to change a title, but I really thought long and hard about the title for this. So I was so pleased that they stuck with it. But I've been published before, and I knew that it might be changed. So I had to be very open-minded and flexible. But to me, the nesting is, I tried to write the book that I would want to read, that if I saw it on the shelf, I'd be like, what is this gem of a book? So that was my aim, really, at the end of the day.
Can you tell us a little bit about your path to publication?
Yes. Gosh, it's a long path, and it's very twisty. And there's a few cliffs and a few holes. Yeah, so, well, I've been writing for a long time. I've been writing since I was 7. I did a master's in creative writing, but I was a poet first. So I never thought I would write a novel. I wrote little stories when I was, like 12 and so on. But as I, went to uni, I thought, no, I'm a poet. And even when I did my master's in creative writing, I didn't even do the prose module. I only did poetry and screenwriting, because I did write films. And then I had this idea in around 2009 I thought it was a poem, but actually it was a novel. And that was really like, wow, okay. So I wrote that and got an agent. I wrote it really quickly. It got published in 23 languages. It was called The Guardian Angel's Journal. It was really weird, but it was my first book, and it really did very well. And then, so I published 5 novels: Guardian Angel's Journal, The Boy Who Could See Demons, I Know My Name, Blame Game. So this is the 5th, and then I've just finished the 6th. So, but I've also published poetry collections, and then academic texts and film studies. So quite a weird trajectory in writing books. But I always knew I wanted to write, and yeah, to try and find your voice and define yourself, I think can be a long process. And even to get published, not every book that I've written has ended up being published. But yeah, it's a long game. I think for anyone who's interested in writing, you've got to love writing, because there's a lot of failure and a lot of rejection. So it's not all success at all. In fact, very little success, but the successes are nice.
So what was the decision to publish this one as C.J. Cooke instead of Carolyn Jess Cooke?
Well, so I changed publisher in 2017. I went with HarperCollins, and we discussed that. So I Know My Name was published in both the UK and the US, and we discussed that it was a slightly different genre. It was more sort of crime. There was no supernatural bits in it. And so they said, well, what about changing your name to sort of highlight that? Not changing it too radically, but what do you think of CJ Cooke? So yeah, we went with that. I guess it's also shorter to put on a book. It's not so much of a mouthful. Plus, I always get called Jess. My husband and I double-barreled our names, obviously, and but it ends up with me being called Jess because that was my original surname. So yeah, I think this is probably a bit more simple.
You mentioned the next thing that you've got coming up is also another Gothic. Can you tell us anything about it?
Oh yes, I'd love to. So it's set in Scotland, and it has kind of 3+ time frames. So part of the story is set in 2021, part of the story is set in 1998, and then there's another narrative from 1662. And it's set on a fictional island off the Black Isle in Scotland, in the Scottish Highlands. And the main character, Liv, has been commissioned to go and paint a mural inside a decommissioned lighthouse, which is very, very Gothic-y in itself. So a lot of it takes place in the lighthouse. And she goes with her 3 girls, and the community, or 3 daughters, and the community is kind of, you know, friendly and lovely to her, but also very superstitious. And the island has a lot of history, particularly involving witches, because obviously Scotland was the worst place in Europe for the witch hunts, and it was a kind of Holocaust. About 4,000 people, mostly women, were killed because they were accused of being witches. So this history and this kind of the tragedy of this island is key to her narrative. And meanwhile, in the 2021 narrative, we have one of the children, one of her daughters, that she takes to the island, has been looking for her sisters, and one of them turns up, but she's still 7 years old, and she has to work out why.
So, do you have a time frame on when that's out? Is that kind of same time next year?
I think it is the same time next year, because it's I think it will be a good sort of Halloween read, a good autumn read or fall read. Yeah, so it's another sort of Gothic. But I just became really, really fascinated in that history in Scotland of witches, and even close to where I live, there's like, 20 minutes down that way, you've got like this plaque in the center of the town where witches were hung. It's really, and I didn't quite know that until fairly recently.
So what has the lockdown process been like for you? Have you been able to still kind of get writing done, or has it been kind of focus being split and kind of hard to do?
Oh gosh, well, I would love to say I've really forced myself to get writing done, but so as of March, my children were out of school. So they were home, and I was still, I work full time, so I was still trying to do that. And yeah, suffice it to say, the focus factor was not uber strong. So, but in Scotland, it was quite strict. So the schools closed. Kids didn't really have Zoom classes or anything like that. And so they were just at home, and we had like a 5-kilometer radius that we could travel in. We couldn't really go outside for a long time unless it was to buy groceries or take an hour of exercise. So that was pretty tough. And it's been nice to see sort of things beginning to reopen again. But it's, we've got like a local lockdown where we now can't go into people's houses. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a bit tough, I think, for everyone. Yeah, not easy.
Yeah. So we've got a question from Michael. He says, when you're writing and you become more invested in your characters, do you ever find your plot adapts to accommodate the characters that suddenly seem more gripping?
That's a really great question, and I think it's a trap that you got to be very careful with, because sometimes, for the sake of the story, for the plot, you have to get your character to do something, but you also got to make it believable. So you do have to think very carefully, would my character act in this manner? And I do feel that I do like to plot now, but the reason I like to plot is because I know I'm not carving it into stone, that I'm simply building a framework that can be then changed. So if I decide, no, my character wouldn't do that, or like I said, if I experiment with an idea, or even experiment with introducing a character, and then that character kind of gets more page time, or becomes more prominent, then the story has to change. So it's character first, really, for me.
And then he says the same question could also apply to locations during research. Have you ever had, maybe a location that you weren't expecting to kind of take over a story that just does?
Yeah, no, that definitely has been the case. And I actually think this is why setting for me now is very important, because when I wrote my second novel, which is called The Boy Who Could See Demons, it was set in Belfast, which is where I'm from, and I never thought I would write about Belfast, but it was set there, and Belfast kind of became like a character in its own right. And I think it was that experience of writing that book that has made me pay attention to settings and just how important they are, because I think it is our relationship to the place we're in. I think that is often, it's a story in itself, isn't it, that relationship?
Awesome. Well, Carolyn, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. If you guys came into the chat late, once we are done talking, Facebook will archive it so you can watch it from the beginning. We'll also be uploading it to the store's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. As I mentioned, we have been talking with CJ Cooke about her new novel, The Nesting, which comes out on Tuesday, September 29th. We will definitely have copies at Murder by the Book. We are doing curbside pickup Monday through Thursday from 10 to 6, and then we are open for in-store appointments on Fridays and Saturdays if you want to come in and browse. I wanted to mention real briefly a couple things we've got coming up. We're super excited. On October 14th, we're going to be doing an event with Tana French. Megan Abbott's going to be interviewing her, so you can get more info about that on the Murder by the Book website. And then the next day, October 15th, we're going to be doing an event with Lisa Jewell. She's going to be in conversation with Ruth Ware, so we're super excited about that as well. Again, Caroline, congratulations on The Nesting. I can't wait for customers to come in and pick it up and hear their feedback on it. It was so lovely to meet you, and have a good rest of your afternoon.
You too. Thanks, guys. Bye. Thanks.